We're really not stress testing the banks?
It's a complete sham.
How should we view this? First of all, I mean, Goldman is allowed then to have this interesting accounting change. It also received perhaps double taxpayers' money from the AIG bailout, and perhaps you can explain that in 20 seconds. I'm not going to try to. I mean, what is this? Is this straight crony corruption in the government?
Clearly, some of the most vocal opponents of fair value and mark-to-market have been some of those institutions that subsequently failed. And
Thank you all.
And they've had to have billions of taxpayer dollars put into them.
Well, it is crony capitalism. It's not the government right now. The big payment, the $12.9 billion, occurred under Secretary Paulson, and that's particularly scandalous because he came from Goldman Sachs. And indeed, while he was at Goldman Sachs, he's the one that got them to invest in the toxic waste. Then Goldman Sachs is in trouble. AIG is in desperate trouble. He's now Treasury Secretary. He was Treasury Secretary under President Bush. He appoints a study group. He puts Goldman Sachs on it to tell him what he should do about AIG. And of course, they tell him he should use AIG to secretly bail out Goldman Sachs to the tune of $12.9 billion. And he does, and that money is not going to be repaid to the taxpayer.
What about the chance of fraud in all of this, in the doling out and the tracking of these public funds in TARP?
Whenever you see this amount of public money being spread around, there's always going to be wrongdoing, and I think the people responsible for that will be revealing it. There'll be cases brought. There will be fraud. It's just inevitable, and I think that's part of the process.
And now Goldman Sachs is going to use, presumably, its first quarter results, which, again, are not a huge profit, but relatively good, considering the climate, to perhaps suggest it can pay back some of the money it received, the other money it received from the TARP, and therefore escape other rules. Do you think that's correct?
That's exactly what it's doing. In fact, it's going to issue new securities to the tune of about $5 billion in a way that will potentially hurt existing shareholders, which is why the U.S. stock market went down, and for the sole purpose of getting management out of the limits on executive compensation. In other words, their own pay. And it's precisely the perverse executive compensation that is the biggest single factor and why there is a worldwide economic crisis. So this is a terrible thing that will bring the next economic crisis.
It's a tangled web, perhaps by design. Professor, thank you very much.
Well, I mean, you've worked in Washington before, and obviously there's a lot of criticism of Tim Geithner. You know, he's been on the job at Treasury now for a few months, but obviously before, as president of the New York Fed, he was a big believer in these stress tests, as you were saying earlier. Ben Bernanke's been on board for a long time. Barack Obama, he's been on the job a couple months. He promised change. It seems like we're getting business as usual, if not worse, than we got from the prior administration.
Yeah, this is actually worse. It's a continuation, and in his jargon, he's a legacy regulator, right? He's a failed legacy regulator, and he's dealing with failed assets, and he's using failed policies, and the result is a continuation of the failure. But now he's adding to it and saying, we're not going to allow failure.
You're talking about, by he, you're talking about Geithner.
Geithner, we're not going to allow failure because we're going to take a massive amount of taxpayer money and subsidize the people that caused the problem. And they are going to make fortune. There's an article just ran that they're expecting well over 20% returns when you run the numbers.
Right, right, of course. Yeah, that's why the bank stocks have risen, because it's a great deal for the banks.
That is exactly why it
There's
is
no
risen.
doubt about that. So
that's a bad news for the taxpayers when you see
yeah.
the bank stocks.
So I got to ask you, is President Obama, is he being misled here by Geithner, or is he on board with this from what you see?
Well, I mean, Summers probably is the real problem behind the scene. If you look at Summers and Geithner and even Goolsby's statements, they are very much bought into the things that produced the problem. So they helped shape the problem. I mean, mostly it was Bush, but they certainly had aid from Summers. Well, not only that, they passed a law that said we couldn't regulate CDS.
Right.
I mean, that's insane.
Right.
And Summers was an absolute leader in that movement.
All right. So then the same guys are still in charge today.
We've got a de facto bank nationalization as it is. This will continue that. It won't be called nationalization, but that's what it is. I think that it's obvious that Congress will be reluctant to give additional money to the banks. This is the way that, on a short-term basis, they can address that issue without going back to Congress. I think it's a necessity. It's absolutely essential.
Rocking and rolling, sishing and splashing over the horizon. What can it be? Looks like it's going to be a free country. They knew that now they'd run their own land. But George III still vowed he'd rule them to the end. Anything I say, do it my way now. Anything I say, do it my way. Don't you get to feeling independent, 'cause I'm gonna force you to obey.
This is just the end of the beginning. The Nader Gonzalez third political force is going to roar through November 4th and into 2009 to build a progressive politics in America that enlists the humane values and the practical needs of the American people. Turn them off! This is a theater of the absurd, my friends. This is a theater of the absurd.